Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka. More than 35 years after the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia, a question that often comes up is this: why does it still matter to study that period today? My guest today is Kamil Nedvědický, first Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in Prague. Trained as a lawyer and a specialist in legal history, he has worked at the Czech Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Justice before joining the institute that researches the history of Nazism and communism in Czechoslovakia. And what I find really interesting is that one of the issues he raises is how the way we dealt with communist crimes after 1989 may shape how younger generations see that period today.
My answer is that it can be a very big problem in nearly future, that so many young people can discuss about the communist regime in some, if I said, revised form, and discuss about the communist regime in early 70s or 80s. It wasn't so bad regime because nobody was punished for doing, for example, the case of asanace. It means to push against the people to go away from the Czechoslovakia.
A forced exile, basically.
Forced exile.
And I also asked what motivates Kamil Nedvědický personally to keep working on this difficult chapter of Czech history.
We must cultivate our freedom and democracy, because losing of freedom and democracy is very non-problematic, as we can say during the communist regime 1948 and so on. So I think it's very inspirative for me, especially, and for my colleagues also, to discuss how knowing or information about the communist or Nazi regime can help to protect our society against the totalitarian tendencies.
So, adjust your pace if you are listening to this episode of Czechast walking or jogging, or settle down in your armchair. This is a Czechast conversation with Kamil Nedvědický.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
I am a lawyer. I am a specialist in legal history and also in the valid law in the Czech Republic or European context. It means I was working for the ministries, for the Ministry of Interior of the Czech Republic in the area of asylum and migration policy, and in the Ministry of Justice in area of crime policy, prisoning and probation, and so on. And nowadays I'm the first deputy director in the Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes. It means I'm in the role of the manager of the statutory deputy of the director of our institution.
As you mentioned, you trained as a lawyer, but you worked for different ministries. So what brought you here?
It's simple. When I was a student in the university, in the law faculty of the Charles University, one of my specialization was the legal history. And it was lucky for me that more than 1.5 years of my studies in the law faculty of the Charles University was about the legal history. It was ended by the state exams. So I can say that I'm also a specialist in this area. It isn't only my hobby, it's also my specialization. The legal history, the history of law, the history of the Czech and Czechoslovak law and the European and the global context of its problematics.
Just one little thing, you are from Třebíč, right?
Yes, yes.
Because I'm from Žďár nad Sázavou, so we are both
I know very well Žďár nad Sázavou
region.
Yeah.
So, do you ever come back to Vysočina?
Yes, I love it because it's my hometown and I love whole Czech and Moravian Highlands or Vysočina, as you said. And I know very, very good and very well Třebíč and also Žďár nad Sázavou, beautiful UNESCO city on the list of UNESCO heritage. So it's close to my heart to be there.
Back to your job, you mentioned migration, for example. How did your previous study kind of shape your view? And now I'm asking specifically about communism.
I think everything is connected because the problematics of asylum or migration is close to the problematics of human rights and also the problematics of security. It's about the security of the state, security of the society, but also it's connected with refugees, people who are coming from other countries and they are fighting or looking for help from state authorities in other countries. It's connected with human rights, for example, the rights of people who are in bad situation, not only economic or social situation, but also in other bad situations, for example, family reunification and so on. And the problematics of history of the 20th century, the communism and also the Nazi regime, it's very close to migration because so many people were refugees from the communist states like Czechoslovakia. So many people during the Nazi regime and also during the communist regime were escaping from home countries to other countries, and they were looking for help from Western democratic states. So I think everything is close to the problematics of the totalitarian regimes of 20th century. And on the other part, from my studies and from the early beginning of the Institute of Study of Totalitarian Regimes, I was in close cooperation with this institution. I was writing articles to books, charters to books, or I was speaker in a conference organized by Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regime. So I was outside this institution, but very close to historians and very, very close to problematics which is connected with the Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regimes.
Just before we started the interview, you mentioned there's going to be an exposition, as I understand, a museum kind of, where there will be together Nazism and communism kind of presented, how we remember them. I know it might seem pretty obvious, but what would you say were the similarities between these two totalitarian systems and what were the differences?
It is a museum because the museum isn't in our act about our institution. We have so many possibilities how to research about the Nazi regime and communism, but we don't have the museum exhibition. It will be only exhibition, but I think it's necessary to do it in this area because the Nazi regime and also the communist regime, it's in our historical memory of the Czech nation. It's difference between the Czech Republic and, for example, France or Italy, because Western countries, they don't have experience with the communist regime. So it's very bad for discussions, for example, between our representatives from the Czech Republic and people from Western universities or Western institutions about the similarity between the communist and Nazi regime, because they don't know more information about the communist terror, repression and resistance against the communist regime. So I think it's a big deal for us and big challenge for us to explain the problematics of the communist regime to people in Western countries and to show them how similar was the behavior of the communist regime with the behavior of the Nazi regime. It means how similar were they are, for example, as members of the secret services and their behavior against the victims or people who were in troubles because they are fighting for freedom or because they origin, for example.
Let me just mention, I actually did a program a few years ago about East Germany. And I actually started with Prora. It's this complex that was used as a huge kind of recreational center for workers in Nazi Germany. And now they are trying to reconstruct it. They are trying to make it into apartments. It's on the Baltic coasts, on the Regen. And why I mentioned that, what was very interesting is that while Nazi Germany ended in the western part of that country as a totalitarian regime, obviously the eastern part of Germany continued under totalitarian regime. And I never realized how many Stasi, the secret police members there were. I mean, they were like 10 times, I think, compared to the population. Why this long introduction? Obviously, in Czechoslovakia, later Czech Republic, obviously, we didn't have such a strong STB secret police, I think, as in Germany. Yet, do you think something of that totalitarian regime still survives in the society? Specifically, I'm asking you as a lawyer and about respect to laws.
Yeah, I think it's very, very strange. As you mentioned in the German example, the German example is quite different from the Czech, Slovak, and Polish and Baltic states and so on. I think the non-reconciliation with the totalitarian regime in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, if you like, it's the biggest problem in this area of historical memory and this area of justice, because people who were responsible for the communist terror, they weren't or aren't in prisons. They are in pension. They are living without problems in this new society. So many of them are members of new elite of the Czech Republic in the economic area, especially in the economic area. So many people from former secret services are very successful. And it's very bad, especially for victims of the communist regimes and their sons or daughters, and nowadays in granddaughters and grandsons, because it's very bad, and it can be compared, for example, with the reconciliation with the Nazi regime. It's completely different. But the crimes of the communist regimes are clear, and we know so many about them, and so many crimes of the communist regime are very similar with the Nazi crimes against the humanity. I can mention only one thing. We have so many examples of that, but I can mention only one thing. The Ďáblice cemetery, the example of the Ďáblice cemetery.
Here in Prague, just for the listeners, Ďáblice is part of Prague.
Yeah, Ďáblice is part of Prague, and in the Ďáblice cemetery, there are places where were buried the remains of victims of the communist and also of the Nazi regime in the same place. It was secret place. I think it was crime against the humanity, because they were people, for example, member of their families who would like to bury them into family graves. But the remains of people who were executed or who were murdered by Nazi and also the communist regime are in the same place, in the Czechast in Ďáblice cemetery, without burial, without humanity, and so on. And I think it's a very good example about the crimes of Nazi and communist regime. We have the similar view on these crimes, but in our, for example, acts, in our legal and in our justice system, the communist and the Nazi regime are completely different in the results. It means we are fighting against the neo-Nazists and their propaganda. For example, we are taking to the court people who are responsible for the Nazi crimes. They are more than 90 years old. So, but it's great. But in connection with the communist regime, prominence of the communist regime are without problems, without punishing, and I think it isn't in accordance with the justice.
It may seem pretty obvious from what you were just saying, but let me, in this part of the interview, ask you why it still matters. Because there are people who will say, it's been more than 35 years since communism fell. I mean, the people who were prominent then are old, very old, if they are not dead. Why bother? What would you say?
I think the problems are, we can discuss about it in two ways. The first way is the continuity of law. Mm-hmm. Because after the fall of the communism, the transformation was about economy, was about some creating of new institutions of the democratic state. But it was connected with the continuity of law. It means the communist law, which was constructed only for supporting the illegitimate communist totalitarian regime, was adopted in a new democratic Czechoslovakia and in democratic Czech law system. And it's a very big problem. It means that it's impossible to punish people who were offenders and who are responsible for the communist crimes. The other way is that the communist regime was existing more than 40 years. And Nazi regime was about the 6 years. It isn't the same. So many people are, or they are feeling that they are responsible for example, so-called normalization. Because the normalization wasn't bloody like the 50s, but it was totalitarian regime with repression, with the state security service, and so we have so many cases about the violence of the communist regime against victims and against people who were against the communist rules. So, but the 40 years, it's so long to say that we can make a cut and be in a especially new situation. And it was very seen in 90s. It's very bad to punish communist criminals, people who were communist prominence, when the judges are also responsible for it.
It's very difficult, yeah? It was very difficult to do that.
It was very difficult because the communist judges were also responsible for that. So it was a very big problem, and I think it's the same in our current situation.
But let me ask you, maybe slightly naively, but when we compare Nazi Germany, especially Nazi Germany, even though there were Nazi regimes elsewhere as well, they were facing, after they lost the war in 1945, I mean, Germany was facing the same problem, obviously, with judges, the laws, but the Nazi laws, the racial laws, for example, were completely cancelled, abolished. But after communism ended, we were changing the legal system, but not so brutally. And again, my question may be slightly naive: why?
The situation in Germany after the Second World War was completely different. It was after the war, and I think the main role played the influence of the Western countries, United States and Great Britain, France, and other Western countries. The situation after the so-called Velvet Revolution in the Czechoslovakia in 1989, it wasn't the situation after the war. The fall of communism was something like economical, social, and completely cultural collapse. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the win of the Western countries. It wasn't...
and it wasn't as bloody, of course.
It wasn't bloody. Yeah. Thank God.
Thank God.
Thank God. But the problem of the, for example, reconciliation with the Nazi regime, it wasn't so great as we can discuss about. We can discuss about so many problems with, for example, connected with the Nazi judges and officers of Wehrmacht and so on. But after the war, the Second World War, And after the fall of Nazi regime, suicide of Adolf Hitler, the situation in Germany was terrible. It was paradoxically better how to cut everything which was connected with the Nazi regime. But after the Velvet Revolution, so many people were discussed only about, for example, economy reform and political reforms, and the reconciliation with the communist regime and punishing of people who were criminals, offenders, and of the communist regime. It wasn't of the first stage, as I can say, if I can say it. And after the 20, 30, and 37 years from the Velvet Revolution, we can see the consequences connected with these problematics, especially with the new generations who were born after the Velvet Revolution.
Could you be slightly more concrete? What sort of consequences are we talking about?
I very always discuss with the students or people who were born after the Velvet Revolution, and the first question from them is, how is it possible that the heads of the communist regime weren't condemned to the prisons? How is it possible that so many victims of the communist regime are still in very bad situation, not only economic, social situation, but also they are in the courts, and they are talking about if they are innocent or non-innocent. It's connected with rehabilitations and restitution and so on. And my answer is that it can be very big problem in nearly future, that so many young people can discuss about the communist regime in some, if I said, revised form, and discuss about the communist regime in early 70s or 80s. It wasn't so bad regime because nobody was punished for doing, for example, the case of asanace. It means to push against the people to go away from the Czechoslovakia.
A forced exile, basically.
Forced exile.
Yeah.
It wasn't in accordance with our law.
Even also, in the laws of communist Czechoslovakia, it wasn't.
And it wasn't in accordance with the international law. But nobody was punished for it. People weren't victims of this act, weren't in a rehabilitation process. So it might be very interesting for some people who can discuss with the young generation about the positive ways of communism, about the, for example, new communism or new Marxism, about the new possibilities, how to prove the communist ideas in our situation, because democracy is always in crisis. We have so many problems with politicians, with the results of election and so on, and it can be very, very bad for the youngest generation because they don't know information and facts about the really existing of communist regime, and I think it can be dangerous for us for the future.
It actually reminded me what you are saying, how I was reporting on the May Day parade, of Communist May Day parade in, I think it was 2001 in Letná, this park in Prague, and there was Jiřina Švorcová, the famous kind of Czech actress who was a staunch communist until the end. And I was listening to her speech and speeches of other communists, and I was listening to it, and I was just wondering, are these people, they were completely serious. They were talking about the communist regime as fair, equal, not this terrible capitalism that we have. I suppose my question is, how do you explain that to students when you speak to students today?
It's everything connected with the facts about the communist regime. If communists are talking about, for example, housing or healthcare during the communist regime, they are always using the false information about it. They are talking about the great healthcare in the Czechoslovakia.
About the good quality of the healthcare.
And the quality of housing. I think it's a very, very big topic of these days. Housing and the prices of flats, especially in Prague, but not only in Prague, in the Czech Republic. So I think the only way how to do it best in this area is to present facts about the communism, really facts, documents from this communist era, and discuss with the young people that the communist propaganda is very, very intensive and very successful, but completely false, without facts and without information. So I think it's the big role of the school, especially role of the universities in the Czech Republic, but also it's the one of the main role of our Institute for Study of Totalitarian Regime, to present the real situation during the communist era, without propaganda, without ideology, only facts and information of concrete offenders of communist crimes and of concrete victims of the communist crimes. I think it's necessary to do it. It's only, in my opinion, it's only one way how to do it in the way of protecting of our society against the neo-communism or communism and something.
For me, I think about it as a kind of parallel about these two things. I mean, democracy is in constant crisis. We have to live with that. There's always, one step away from some kind of disaster. And when it comes to this thinking about the past and educating young people, that it's a constant struggle. You have, or it's a constant work. I wouldn't call it a struggle. Would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. As Winston Churchill said, bad things about the democracy, but the democracy is the best system of our for our livings. Yeah. I hope it's only way how to explain the problems of democracy. Education is the best point how to do it, how to educate people, not only youngest generation, I must say, also people who were living in the communist regime. Because during the communist regime, I think we must say that the communist propaganda was very successful. And so many people are very surprised that they are hearing about the facts about the communism, not only in political way or not only in the area of repression or terror, but also in the economic or social systems. They are very surprised because their memory is completely different. They are talking about some propaganda things from the communist era, not about the facts. As I said about the healthcare, I think it can be a very good example that the healthcare was quality and very cheap, and it isn't true. We know about it, so many things about it. How was it different for example, prominence of communist regime and ordinary people, and on the other side, how was it problematic with the paying for some in hospitals and so on. Education, it's the biggest point to do it, how to do it good for every people, not only in the Czech Republic. I think it's necessary to present these facts and things about the communist regime. Also people in Western countries, as I said, so many people in Western countries, they don't have good information about the communist regime and communist era. They are only seeing the communist parties in their countries. They are only hearing about some things about the communism, but not really facts. For example, yesterday or 2 days ago, some students from France with their professors were coming in our seat here in Archa building, and we were talking about the Velvet Revolution, so-called Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, and about the communist regime. And not only students from France, but also their professors are very surprised because in France, the education about communism is close to zero, I must say. They were very surprised hearing about execution of opponents of the communist regime, people who were murdering during the communist regime in prisons, and people who were who were victims of the communist terror. And I think it's necessary to inform not only a new generation in Czech Republic and people in Czech Republic, but also people in Western countries, what it was and what is communism.
I would only sign that, as we say in Czech. I spent 3 years in France, actually, in the 1990s, and I suppose it's because the Communist Party has been always quite strong in France, and people didn't see it, and still probably don't see it as such a big threat. But speaking of the Communist parties, just a few days ago, we marked the anniversary of February and the coup d'etat by the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. And why I mention that, I remember how difficult it was for me in France to explain that it was a coup d'etat, that it was illegal. If you were to explain that as shortly as possible, was it really illegal? And if yes, why?
Thank you for this question, because the problematic about the coup d'etat in 1948, it's my specialization, one of my specialization, because when I was a young student, I made researching about February 1948 in Czechoslovakia. And I found so many documents about the mission of the ministries of the Czechoslovak government, and very successful communist propaganda about these coup d'etat. They said everything was legally in according with our laws, and so on and so on. But the first thing which is necessary to say is that it was completely illegal. Not only in the way of repression or pressure against the President Beneš, but also in the formal constitutional part, because not only 12 ministers were in demission, but it was 14.
They resigned, yeah, we should probably say in English.
Because resigned 14 ministers. And the government of the Czechoslovakia after that didn't exist, because it was more than half of the...
So the government should have been dissolved, and there should have been free elections, which is what the kind of democratic ministers who resigned wanted. Yeah.
So after everything what was after the 25th of February 1948 in this area wasn't in accordance with the constitution of Czechoslovakia. Everything was illegal, and I think it's a very, very visible thing which can be say in the connection with February 1948.
Quite recently, I actually interviewed Martin Kroupa of the Memory of Nations organization, or Postbellum, and the project. We talked mainly about the project. I think you cooperate quite closely. Yeah.
Yes,
if you were to describe how you cooperate and why is it important?
It's very important because we are for 37 years after the Velvet Revolution, and so many people they have gone, and it's necessary to have some documents about their lives and about their lives during the communist regime. So we are cooperating with the Postbellum, and we are creating so many documents, videos, or documents about people who were victims, but also people who were consisting in the totalitarian regime structures. I think it's very good evidence how to explain the communist regime and the ordinary life of people during the communist regime to the youngest generation, because we can talk about millions and millions victims of the communist regime. We can talk about terror or
but it's kind of abstract. What we need is
very
stories,
abstract,
right?
Yeah, it's very abstract, and we can see in these videos and in these interviews with the people who were influenced by communist regime, we can see the concrete stories of these people. So I think it's very interesting, and it's better than only statistics.
We are coming to the close of our interview, but let me ask you two last questions. First of all, if you go to work, what makes you proud of what you do? What makes you look forward to another day in the office?
Yeah, I think it's necessary to say that one thing is very interesting for me to see people who were, for example, political prisoners. We have not so many people who are living still, who were, for example, in 50s in prisons. And it's very interesting for me to discuss with these people about their experience from the communist regime. And when they are satisfied with our work, it's a very pleasure for me.
It's very fulfilling, isn't it?
Yeah. It's great for me. And I must say, in connection with students and the youngest generation, it's very interesting and very successful for us when the students or young people are discussing with us about our work, about our research, about documents, about situation during the totalitarian regime, and about what does it mean living in democratic or freedom society. Because they were born after the fall of communism and freedom, democracy, human rights, and so on. It's something normal for them. But they don't know what does it mean living in a totalitarian regime or democratic, non-democratic regime, and so on. It's very inspirative for us to discuss with them what does it mean to lose the freedom, to lose the democracy, and living in the totalitarian regime. And I must say, it's very interesting. But I must say one thing more. I think it's something like protection of our society. How to protect our society.
It's a way to protect the society
against the totalitarian tendencies and dictatorships and so on, non-democratic systems, because the freedom or democracy, it isn't something stable. It's something about the process. So we can discuss it, and we must cultivate our freedom and democracy, because losing of freedom and democracy is very non-problematic, as we can say during the communist regime 1948 and so on. So I think it's very inspirative for me, especially, and for my colleagues also, to discuss how knowing or information about the communist or Nazi regime can help to protect our society against the totalitarian tendencies.
And maybe my last question, you have a lot of books that you are publishing, about 25, I think, each year.
Every year, yes.
How about social networks? Because we are talking about young people, and they really get information mostly, I think, from social networks.
Yeah, I love books very much, but I know that the modern systems of communication are completely different. So we are preparing for this big change from the books to social events and so on. For example, I can say that we are preparing a virtual reality. One day in Gulag. Mm-hmm. It means you can try how was it in a really Soviet Gulag, because this virtual reality is connected with our researching in the really Gulags. So I think it's very interesting for especially the youngest generation to use virtual reality and see what was Gulag, and how was it in these Gulags with people and with everyday life in this Gulag. So it's one thing. Other thing, our books are very strong, problematic for ordinary people, because it's a result of our researching. So we have so many books, with more 500 or 1,000 pages. Yeah. So we are preparing, for example, comixies.
Cartoons,
cartoons, thank you. With interesting stories, especially for young generation. Stories of young people who were, for example, against the occupation of the Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact in 1986, about the concrete examples of families who were repressed by the communist regime for their, for example, fighting for freedom of speech or freedom of religion. So I think it's the possible way how to transfer only from books to the social systems, so to social nets and so on, and to discuss with the youngest generation with the possibilities and with the language, which is very interesting and very exciting for them.
Kamil Nedvědický, thank you very much indeed, and good luck in your work.
Thank you very much.
That was Kamil Nedvědický, first Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in Prague. If you liked this episode of Czechast or any other episode from our ever-growing archive, please consider liking or following the podcast, and even better, recommend it to your friends. It really helps me keep this podcast running. You can also find much more information and many more stories about Czechia at radio.cz. I'm Vít Pohanka. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay curious, and until next time, as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.